You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
It's time to get all your Star Wars news in a single file. This is Canon Fodder. Here are your hosts, Mark Mulcaster, Brian Cameron, Matt Booker, and Mark Newbold.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Canon Fodder. I'm your host Brian Cameron, but in this special edition of the show, I'm handing the reins over to my colleague Mark Newbold, who will be interviewing Titan's Chris Cooper, the editor of Star Wars Insider magazine. Chris's other work at Titan has included Star Trek magazine and Doctor Who magazine. He's also written for Big Finish Audio. Star Wars Insider is at an interesting point in time, as it's just about to relaunch original Star Wars literature again in the magazine. There's also a whole host of incredible specials on the horizon, so I can't wait to listen into this interview. Let's head over to Mark.
So to badly misquote Sean Bean in Lord of the Rings, one does not simply walk into Titan and take over the Star Wars Insider. So how did you get to that desk? How did this job, this role come to you?
Well, I started off editing Star Trek magazine, which I took over in about 2011, tail end of 2011. I'd written a Torchwood comic for Torchwood magazine in about 2010. And I was just looking around for work, really, and I just happened to speak to one of the senior editors when they were looking for someone to take over Star Trek. So I took over that. I did various other comics along the way. I edited the Simpsons comic, the UK version of that for a while. I edited the Star Wars comic, which finished in 2014, I think, when that went off to another publisher. So I'd done various bits and bobs over the years, and I knew everyone there. I'm a freelancer, so I dip into the office and dip out of the office once or twice a week. And eventually Star Wars came up towards the end of 2017. And I couldn't really say no, really. I'd done 5 or 6 years on Star Trek, which seemed like a 5-year mission. Seemed like the right time to move on. So suddenly I had Star Wars, which is quite exciting. Not something I ever thought I'd get the opportunity to do, because Jonathan had been doing it for donkey's years. So that's how I ended up, really. I probably started working in magazines about 2006, working on a Doctor Who Adventures, which was like a children's Doctor Who comic, basically. I used to want to do the letters page and do a few features, and I used to write comic strips for that. Basically, one sci-fi gig led to another sci-fi gig, which led to the Star Wars gig.
Doing Doctor Who, massive franchise. You get a Trek at a very fertile time for Trek.
Yes.
And then you move on to Star Wars, which you could argue is the big daddy of busy franchises. So how was that change? When obviously working on the Who license, you're dealing with the BBC, you're working on the Trek license, you're working with CBS, now you're dealing with Disney and Lucasfilm. So they're all very different, I would imagine. What are the changes between all of them, getting information and so on and so forth?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing, I guess, with Star Trek is it was J.J. Abrams was in charge of Star Trek when I was doing that magazine for a long time. So that was a very similar relationship, I think, to the one Jonathan was probably having with the sequel trilogy, certainly The Force Awakens. I kind of came on board around The Last Jedi kind of time. It is different. I mean, my relationship with CBS, when I first started doing Star Trek, corporate-wise, they've swapped around. So I was dealing with the licensing people at CBS. With Star Wars, I'm dealing with the publishing arm of Lucasfilm. So it's a slightly more direct relationship with the production company. Working on Doctor Who, I was a lowly writer, so I didn't really have to deal up with the brand managers of that. They are different relationships. I think we're more directly linked in with Lucasfilm than I probably was with Star Trek and CBS. Certainly with Bad Robot handling Star Trek at the time. So yeah, we kind of have a closer, and it's a long relationship that Titan have had with Lucasfilm as well. So it oils the wheels a little bit.
Absolutely. I was going to say, one thing that strikes me is that with the UK Star Wars magazine, I think the Trek magazine launched around about the time of Generations, sort of 94, 95, and Star Wars launched around about the same time. So those UK versions of the Titan magazines have kind of run concurrently over the years with varying regularity, obviously. And we can't even talk about 2020 because it's just knocked everything out of the water, hasn't it? But in terms of the official Trek magazine in the UK was very much the UK version of the Communicator that you used to get in the States, and the Star Wars mag was the UK version of the Insider, and then they merged and finally got the numbering sorted out, so we're on the same numbering system and all that sort of stuff. But there is that lineage that you can trace right through to, I was going to say Bantha Tracks is even before Bantha Tracks. I think the first 4 or 5 issues were just the Star Wars Fan Club magazine. So do you sense that when you're doing your work on the magazine, that this isn't just a licensee project to promote a brand? It is actually the ancestor, if you like, of that official magazine.
Yeah, that's interesting you make that point, because I was writing the editorial for issue 200 the other day, and I actually reference Bantha Tracks when I used to be a member of the fan club, and it used to come through the mail. It was this lovely folded up piece of A4 that you'd unravel and get really excited about.
Yeah.
And it was the first time I'd really thought about that as a connection, that what I do now is what the editors way back then filled Bantha Tracks with, and I got excited about at the other end of the process. And I think after a pretty tough year that 2020's been, and a big gap when I couldn't do any work on the magazine, I suddenly remembered and realised that you are part of that massive lineage, and that the people who pick up the magazine at the other end are excited to pick it up. Just writing that editorial reminded me of how I used to be excited. And it just reminds you of the importance of the magazine, really, the importance of a nice printed thing. The internet has made everything so immediate. People expect to click on something and look at something. Putting the magazine together, it takes months.
Yeah.
To put the magazine together, and you've planned it months in advance of that, and little things can change. But then when it's a finished object that someone can pick up and hold and collect and file on a shelf, and if they remember a particular thing from a particular issue, they've got a connection with it, they can pull it down from the shelf and have a flick through and look at the photos and stuff. And yeah, I was genuinely, last week I did this, was reminded of how cool that is.
I'm very much into the history of these sort of things, and I'm conscious that having done different websites over the year, I mean, you're my third insider editor that I've interviewed. I interviewed Frank Parisi, then Jonathan, and now yourself. So that's a nice thing for me personally, being involved with the magazine as well for a good few years. But I'm conscious that all the writing I do on websites physically will never weigh as much as a page of one issue of Star Wars Insider. It's a tangible thing, isn't it? You know, those old Bantha Tracks, we've still all got them. You can own them.
Yeah, and even if you know, mine are in a cardboard box, which I do reference in the editorial, actually. Yeah. They're in a little cardboard box that I made, God knows how many years ago, a shoebox.
Yeah.
You know, one of my shoes wouldn't fit in that shoebox anymore, but I obviously had a pair at the time. Yeah, you've got them, and these are lovely things. It's why we collect as well. I think there's a tendency of a Star Wars fan to be a bit of a collector as well. Mm. You end up with a load of rubbish ephemera, but you just can't help yourself.
You mentioned issue 200, big landmark issue for Insider. The process, given we've just referenced 2020 being the worst year and we can't wait to get past it, but what's it been like this year, trying to not only keep the brand visible, keep your subscribers happy, understanding that the world has been tipped upside down, and also pulling together this 200th issue, which is, as I say, quite an important one?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was initially planned. 200 was on schedule to be out at Celebration this year. Yeah. So everything was planned a long, long time ago, and then just kind of went on hold, really. I don't even know how long this year we weren't on newsstands. I've completely lost track. I think it was about 6 months. Yeah. We seem to be running very, very late anyway. So 200 is now coming out, I think, at the end of January, beginning of February, instead of last May. So that gives you an indication of the juggling that's been going on. Ironically, it didn't really give us any more time to put the thing together, because we were just, we were down tools, really, out of the picture for a little while. There's a lot of stuff in it that actually has just been done more recently than it would have been. There's a lot of great content. I'm really quite proud of 200. We haven't quite finished it yet. In fact, we're still right in the depths of designing. But there's some great things in it. Some things have been kind of rejigged. Other things have happened in the world that have been incorporated a little bit. We're tweaking a few of the design layouts just to perk things up a little bit, but not a great deal. There's a handful of new things in there. But yeah, logistically, the big thing was, having had some time off over the summer, reminding myself what I had planned, because it had really gone out of my head completely. So it was kind of diving back in and finding all the things that I'd done and replotting certain other things.
Star Wars doesn't stop for anyone, does it? There's still news coming. We've got Mando here. There's new projects being announced. You've still got to incorporate that as best you can. Yeah,
well, I mean, tons of stuff did have to change. Actually, in previous issues, not just 200, but we came back with 197.
Yeah.
197 was the one that was supposed to come out in May, because that was the Empire Strikes Back one, which is a great issue. I was really pleased with that issue. But because of production, I think there was a really weird thing that happened with the fonts, and it printed with a really weird little font error. which was nothing anyone could have done anything about, because it was once it had gone to the printer, there was a software thing that changed a certain letter. I still don't know exactly what happened, but I know it was something technical that had been through several stages of proofing. Everyone had looked at it. It was all fine. And then something happened. So 197, I think that eventually showed up in September. So a lot of that issue had a lot of little tweaky rejigs in it, like the news pages, just to not be 6 months out of date. Same with 198. By 199, I was getting back into the swing of things.
Hello, I'm Ahmed Best, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
One of the things that Insider used to do, and then didn't for a while, and now he's going to do again, is original fiction, which has really lit a lot of people up. You must be excited about that, because it brings so many more eyes to the magazine as well.
Well, the thing is, we've known for a long while that people have been asking for it. It's just been a question of the right time and getting the right things together. And we're very fortunate that the High Republic thing is happening, because we've been able to work with the Lucasfilm publishing people and some very lovely writers to expand what's going on in the novels and the comics and bring some of that to Insider. So it's for the time being, at least, for the best part of the next year, it'll be High Republic short fiction that acts as kind of companion pieces to what's going on in the other media. Yeah. The first thing we've got coming is by Charles Soule. He's written a story for the first 2 issues, which is just nice Star Warsy stuff. And it really, well, the first part of his story really ties into just before Light of the Jedi and features some of those characters that are in that. And it's quite a cute, fast-paced little story. It's quite exciting. It sets these characters up. And then the second story coming in 201 is Cavan Scott. It's written a nice little 2-part story for us. And then it goes on from there. So, yeah, over the course of the next year, every issue is it's kind of a 2-part story, basically, is what's happening. So we'll have, over the course of 2 issues, a part 1, a part 2, that will hopefully have a nice little cliffhanger in the middle, and it will be quite exciting. And then the next story is a different author. It is really cool to be involved in that as well, because I think a lot of people seem to be very excited about it.
And also because we have this unified canon of TV and films and books and comics and everything else, it makes the Insider now an essential purchase for people who want to stay on top of all that story.
Well, I'd like to say it's always been an essential purchase, but yeah, it's nice to be tied into something like that, because obviously with the films, we're kind of reporting on. It's difficult to do that before films or TV series come out, because we don't want to spoil anything for anyone, so we're kind of chasing a little bit. But to be an integral part of the High Republic thing is a really fantastic opportunity for the magazine, and hopefully entertaining for people who want to pick it up and read it.
One of the things that you mentioned was that you always keep an eye on design and tweak and update things. Is that something that you consciously, and the designers as well, of course, are always looking at, sort of tweak it and change it and keep it moving and keep it fresh?
We've got a design template. I think, was it about 2017, I think, we had a new look. And we're sticking with that new look because we like it, because it's quite stylish, we think, in a humble way. But every feature, got a fabulous designer called Andrew who works on it. Every feature, it's not a strict template. So we've got a kind of a footer and a header, pictures and words. It's never going to look hugely different. But he'll take a look at each feature, and we'll take a look at the imagery that's there. And he'll try and do something really special with it. We've got an interview with Ashley Eckstein, and she sent us a fabulous picture, really, really lovely picture with an orange background. And it's just a fabulous opening spread, because it's just got lovely, colourful impact, and that informs the rest of the layout, because if you've got a strong image to lead with, you can take little cues from that and put little features and stuff. There's not a single feature that hasn't had some thought visually put into it. I mean, let alone words. And it's always an effort to try and make it spring off the page and use interesting photographs, preferably ones that people haven't seen before, or in a combination that draws connections between story points, if you're talking about a story point. Just things in this issue, in 200 particularly, the quiz, I asked them to change the colour of the background, just because I didn't want it to be black. I wanted it to be sort of very dark blue. Yeah. And it just lifts things a little bit, just little tweaks here and there.
When you get an issue come in and it's laid out, and I'm sure there's horse trading between yourselves and Lucasfilm about what the focus for obviously each issue is going to be, because it's constantly changing, and you're all looking so far ahead to what's coming out that we might not see for 6 months or longer. What is that process like? Because there may be certain things that you assume in the moment would be the focus, but not necessarily the case, because they're spinning so many plates and juggling so many things. How does that work?
Because there's such a diverse audience for Star Wars, it's been around since I was little. There are different generations that grew up with the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy, and now the sequel trilogy or the Clone Wars or Rebels or whatever. Over that period, there are different audiences built into Star Wars, and people appreciate different things, and even people of the same Star Wars generation. Some people like models and special effects. Other people are devoted to characters. Everyone has their own take. Every fan, I think, has their own take on Star Wars. And what I try and do is, rather than focus on one element for a whole issue, and sometimes we will, but generally I'll try and have a nice balance so that I can make something in there that appeals to at least someone. But really, a broad range of fans can pick an issue up and they will find at least something in there that they're interested in, specific to their interest, which is difficult when you've only got an 84-page to 100-page magazine, because there's a lot more perspectives on Star Wars than I can possibly do in one issue. But I try and keep things varied. The word magazine, by definition, means a collection of different things. And that's how I view the magazine, really. Something light, something dark, something in-depth.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark FanthaTracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
What would you say your primary responsibility is? Because you've not only got a responsibility as an editor to make sure it all hangs together and works as a readable cover-to-cover piece, but also, in a sense, you've got a responsibility to Star Wars news and history as well. So what do you see as your prime sort of role in making every issue come together? That was quite a deep question, wasn't it?
That was quite a deep question.
Because every Insider is a document of its time, isn't it? It's what's going on in Star Wars near as damn it now.
Yeah,
and people could look back at that in 10 years' time and get a sense of what the landscape was.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. If we're around the time of a film release, for example, for 2 or 3 issues around a film release, you're going to have a heavy focus on characters and stories and situations that pertain to that release. And that kind of has to be planned ahead and thought through. But then around that, you can talk about other things as well. And I think that's where the conceptualizing is probably the most important thing as an editor. Looking at what you've definitely got to cover, looking at things that maybe aren't as timely, but have a relevance to something that's going on, and then something that's completely oblique to that, but captures another section of the audience who might, well, for example, in 199, we've got an interview with Charles Soule talking about his new book, but talking about the comics that he's written. So there's an appeal there to people who are fans of Star Wars literature or Star Wars comics who will be familiar with his work. There are other people who haven't ever touched that side of things. There are plenty of fans who will just watch the films and don't really touch any of that kind of, I won't call it expanded universe because that's wrong. You can't call it that anymore. But the stuff that's away from the screen. So being able to isolate those things and think that has an appeal to those people, this has an appeal to those people, this is something that personally I find interesting, and that's probably my guiding light with a magazine, is if it's an idea that I find interesting or a person that I find interesting, and we can talk about those things in the contents of the magazine, I'll find space for those. So I kind of have to use myself as the audience. I try not to second guess who might need what, but at the same time be aware Star Wars isn't mine.
It is tricky, isn't it? I think with Star Wars now, as it gets older and new aspects come in, and it's similar to Trek. With Trek suddenly got Discovery and Picard and Lower Decks, and it's constantly expanding, but you're still always going to have those original trilogy, and then your next gen people want the focus. And with Star Wars, Mandalorian comes out, and all of a sudden you can without irony go back to the holiday special, for example, and pull out all the little connective tissue bits from that and put focus on. So the bigger it gets, the more, in a way, I guess you've got to play with.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating time actually, because there is new stuff, and you know that there's more stuff coming, even if you don't necessarily know precisely what it's going to be. But it feels very fertile at the moment. I think now that the Skywalker saga is done and dusted, and they can focus on not expanding the universe, but exploring different corners of it and different characters. I think The Mandalorian in Season 2 is doing a really good job of that. I mean, I know there's lots of callbacks and references, but that little township that's surrounded by a wall and is quite closed off and it's quite oppressive and horrid, and you really wouldn't want to live there. And then the watery planet where there's Mon Calamari walking around in fisherman's sweaters and dungarees. Yeah. It really feels to me that it's taking an opportunity to paint in different corners of that galaxy that we've not seen before, but there's a realness to them, there's a reality to them, which I think is quite exciting, because once you start to do that physical world building, you can imagine new stories taking place in those places, which opens up new opportunities for Lucasfilm to tell new stories, which I think is really, really exciting.
With now Mandalorian. His films are still a couple of years away, but we've got Mandalorian. We know we've got Cassian and Obi-Wan on the way. There's Bad Batch coming. Plenty of rumours knocking around about other stuff. So you as an editor, given that you've got that constraint of, we're between 84 and 100 pages an issue, we come out every 6 weeks, do you envisage a time when somebody at Lucasfilm picks up the phone and goes, Chris, I think this might have to go monthly? Do you see that coming? Because not for any other reason than that there's so much news and so much that could be covered. You haven't got the real estate to fit everything in.
No, that's very true. I mean, it is a struggle. I don't know. I mean, it's a different market now, I think, to when magazines were monthly, because the internet's there and people are constantly just thumbs to phones scrolling through. I do it all the time, just sitting there scrolling up. So I think there's a different market. I mean, magazines obviously struggle, certainly this year. Publishing in that sector has had a torrid time.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I can't really see financially how a magazine can really do a monthly thing, because we put a lot in. You'd end up with a lower page count, I think. In that case, you're not really benefiting from having a more regular release schedule. There is lots of stuff, but the benefit of Insider is it can kind of sit back and look at it and take its time to look at things. Whereas I think a lot of internet, God, I sound like a granny. a lot of websites are more immediate. They're more interested in breaking news. You can't really do as much long form stuff. You can't really do meditative stuff in quite the same way. I don't think it's the same experience. And they do stuff on StarWars.com that I think is great. They do a similar sort of content to us, really. But I think Insider has more time to cogitate and formulate ideas and just let things sink in and then do something nice with it. Maybe that's our advantage.
I agree. I think, like you say, and it comes back to that tangible collectability of actually owning a physical thing. I think that plays into Insider's hands in a nice way. And that having the fiction in there now will only help that. And interviews with people that others can't necessarily get to will only help that. It all feels like it's working to its advantage. Yeah, and it's a nice thing to look forward to because you can't just access it every day. No, you've got to wait 6 weeks until it turns up. I like to have a magazine. I mean, I don't, because I'm now old and I need to wear reading glasses. Magazine print is a pain for me. It's a good job I get to read Insider on my big screen while I'm making it because I can make the font really massive. And actually read it. But I have a soft spot for magazines. I still like Doctor Who magazine. I pick that up occasionally. They're fun things. They're exciting things. But then I'm old, Old is not necessarily bad, Chris. I believe in the tangible. I like tangible.
Hello, this is Sam Whitwer, and you are listening to Fantha Tracks.
You mentioned Doctor Who just then. You're involved with Big Finish. Tell me a little bit about that.
I've only done one Doctor Who, funnily enough. And that was about 2014, maybe 2011. I can't remember. 2014.
He's a time traveller. It doesn't matter what year it was.
Yeah, I'll just I'll give him an ask. He'll know, or she'll know, depending on which one I catch up with. And I've got one coming out next year. But I've also written Blake Seven and a couple of Torchwoods, just drama stuff. A Blake Seven novel as well, a Doctor Who novel as well. But that was years ago. That's BBC Books. That's the kind of my not quite day job. Day job is the magazine. The not day job is writing stories, silly stories about space.
There's worse things to be doing. You mentioned Torchwood. I mean, that with the Christmas special coming up, Captain Jack's back. That's going to feel more relevant than ever, isn't it? Yeah, well, I don't think it ever isn't relevant because Big Finish have been delving in and out of Torchwood for a fair few years now. That's another fertile storytelling ground. And the actors are all fantastic, and the stories are bonkers. I love what Big Finish do. They kind of expand on what you can do in television, not just because it's an audio medium, so you can do whatever visuals you like. You can make things huge, but you can make things small as well. Yeah, they can do stories that are just so small and tight around a certain few characters, or they can do these enormous, expansive epics, and they do. So, I mean, whatever you're a fan of, old British sci-fi fantasy drama, Big Finish can probably provide you with something. It must be interesting or exciting to hear those words though come to life through a voice performer and such.
It is great. I mean, that is. I will readily admit that that's my first love, is writing stories that then turn into things by actors and directors. Sometimes I go along to studio to recording it, and it's always entertaining. It's always great to sit down and have words that you've written, somebody interpreting those words and bringing something different to it than you kind of expected. I did a Torchwood called Sargasso, which came out beginning of last year, maybe beginning of 2019, when the world was still relatively nice. And that was great because when I was in the studio listening to that, I wanted the story to end differently because the actors were so wonderful that I didn't want what was going to happen to them happen to them.
Oh wow!
So I had to sit like that. But that was tremendous. That's my fantasy job. And ridiculously, I am doing my fantasy job as a day job anyway, the other one, the magazine, because that's ridiculous. Who gets to play with Star Wars Insider like Mr. Big Man and write an editorial and stuff? It's ridiculous.
So we're nearly going to turn the page on this interview, but one thing I would love to know, and you don't have to answer it if you don't want to, but I'd love to know, if there's one thing that you could add to Insider that either the magazine has never done, and I'm thinking of, it's just come out there that Anthony Daniels is doing a Wonder column, and things like that. You know, that was a wonderful part of the magazine back in the day. And there's been other things over the years, different sections and such, and just opportunities for the magazine to sort of get its name out there more, doing stuff at Celebration and such. Is there something that either that's never been in the magazine, or you'd like to add to the magazine, or that you'd just like to do to let the whole world know that really you should be reading this thing?
Well, you're talking about a magazine that's, 33 years old, give or take a name change along the way.
Yeah.
You know, that's such a big question. Ideas tend to pop into your head. The sort of content I like to be able to speak to actors. I love being able to speak to writers because I like to know how they got from A to B.
Yeah.
I think I'd love to do more of that. I mean, it's a bit difficult because I don't think we really want to necessarily understand the skeleton of what has made a Star Wars story, because it pulls back the curtain a little bit too far. But it is stuff that really interests me. You know, the Star Wars archive, the interview in that, I would talk to every single writer that had ever written a Star Wars story with that amount of depth, because I find it personally fascinating. Yeah. But at the same time, I can appreciate that people don't necessarily want that much detail. They want to just enjoy the stories as they are. That would be my fantasy thing. I don't think we can really do it. Certainly not in the space that we have. I mean, most of our features are about 6 or 7 pages. You can go into a certain amount of depth, but the depth of that content in that book is just it's rewarding, you know. I like to know how stories develop. I think it's a fascinating subject, and it doesn't necessarily get as much limelight as how a spaceship was made to fly or how a costume was made, which are equally fascinating.
You want to know how they make the sausage? That's what you're saying.
I would love to just walk around the volume, you know. That's that whole stage cross-up. I'm fascinated by all of the technology that goes into that, which is kind of one of the things I loved about Star Wars when it first came out, and I started discovering about model making and the Dijkstraflex camera and all those things really fascinated me. And those are the things that make me do what I do now, because I wanted to understand and pick apart the technological side of things, which is kind of similar to making a magazine, just not quite as fancy.
Thanks for listening to Canon Fodder. If you want to be part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com and download the Fanthatracks app to follow us on your mobile device. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. And remember to comment, like, share and subscribe on all our social medias at Fanthatracks. Leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcaster or smart speaker of choice.